When Jada and Janelle Rivers stepped through the towering gates of Rosewood Hills Academy, they expected challenges. But not this. Not the stares that clung like shadows. Not the silence that screamed. They were ready for the workload. Ready to be the new girls. But they weren't ready to become targets from the very first moment. What waited for them beyond those gates wasn't just a new school. It was a system built to make them small. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The school itself looked like a page out of an Ivy League brochure. Grand red brick buildings, wrapped in ivy, halls lined with mahogany paneling, and a courtyard so perfectly manicured, it felt untouched by time. Every detail screamed legacy, tradition, and quiet exclusivity. It was a school that didn't just teach it, reminded you of where you stood. And for Jada and Janelle, it was clear that wherever they stood, it wasn't where anyone else wanted them to be. Their first steps inside were met with a silence too cold to ignore. Students turned just enough to look, whispered just loud enough to be heard. The way their eyes lingered, the way their laughter paused and resumed, it was all part of a quiet orchestration. They weren't curious, they weren't welcoming, they were watching, judging, and deciding. Jada walked with her chin high, posture clean. Janelle stayed just beside her, matching her stride, eyes scanning but never flinching. They had learned long ago how to move like they belonged, even when everything around them tried to say otherwise. They were daughters of Derek Rivers, a man who raised them not just to survive, but to stand. He didn't sugarcoat the world. He taught them how to see it for what it was, how to carry themselves with strength, how to never let someone else's opinion become their truth, and most importantly, how to control the fire inside them, without letting it burn them alive. Derek had made sure they were trained, not just in discipline or posture, but in martial arts. He had taught them balance, power, and precision. But more than the physical, he had taught them emotional discipline. Never swing first. Never fold. Let your silence be your armor. Let your presence speak. And that presence? It unsettled people. They hadn't even made it to their lockers when the first words were thrown. Matching uniforms and matching faces. A boy sneered from where he leaned against the courtyard wall. Didn't know we ordered a set. Jada heard it. Janelle felt it. But they didn't stop. They didn't blink. Their father's voice echoed in their minds. They want your reaction. Don't give it to them. That boy was Ryan Mallory. Blonde, polished, and cocky. He had the effortless charm of someone who'd never been told no. His reputation was well-rooted. A ringleader, untouchable, and always surrounded by boys who followed his lead like shadows. Zach and Brent. Loud where Ryan was smooth, cruel where he was calculated. The words that day weren't threats. Not yet. They were just probes. Little digs dressed up as jokes. Microaggressions with a grin. The kind you couldn't call out without being labeled too sensitive. Bet they've never seen a place this clean, Brent chuckled one morning, as they passed. Wonder if they even know how to use a locker. Zach added, not even pretending to whisper. Jada clenched her teeth. Janelle's fingers curled around her bag strap. But they walked on, eyes forward, shoulders back, unshaken on the surface, but the tension underneath was growing heavier each day. In the classrooms, it was no better. Teachers called their names with a tone that clipped their identities short. They were marked present, but treated like absence. No eye contact, no warmth, just ticking boxes. In the cafeteria, no one invited them to sit. In group projects, no one partnered with them, unless forced. And in every hallway, the crowd seemed to part in a way that forced them off center, made them feel like intruders in a place they had every right to be. But they never faltered. They weren't just trying to prove something to the school. They were trying to prove something to themselves, that they could hold the line, that they could rise above it, that they could resist without losing themselves. And still through all of it, Ryan watched, calculating, waiting, testing the line. He wasn't done. Not yet. This wasn't just a test of patience. It was the beginning of a war, and the Rivers sisters, whether they liked it or not, had just entered the battlefield. And it was always like that. Quiet exclusions wrapped in polite language. The classrooms didn't offer sanctuary. In science lab, they were consistently paired together because no one else volunteered. In social studies, a project on community history became an exercise in how to speak without saying anything. After a student presentation featured a slide of neighborhood crime rates with a side glance thrown their way. When Jada and Janelle offered to present on Black historical figures in the area, their request was redirected. Why not do something more local? It was everywhere, subtle and exhausting. No single moment, loud enough to scream about, but they were drowning in it all the same. One morning, while walking to class, someone brushed past Janelle, knocking her books loose. It wasn't hard, but it was deliberate. The boy Logan, from history class, offered no apology. Just a glance over his shoulder like she was supposed to be the one who got out of the way. Jada bent to help gather the books. Neither spoke. As they stood, Janelle's hand brushed against her sister's, and that was all it took. Grounding. A silent exchange of strength. They weren't alone, not in this. They didn't cry. They didn't snap. But every day added another brick to the wall they were building inside. One that held their fury in place and reminded them who they were. They had been trained for this. Not for violence, not for revenge, but for the clarity of control. Discipline wasn't just about fists. It was about endurance. The contrast between the school's appearance and its spirit grew more jarring by the day. Rosewood Hills boasted tradition and excellence. Its stone fountains, framed awards and glass-encased trophies painted a picture of integrity. But beneath the sheen lived a culture that thrived on silence. It didn't scream racism. It whispered it behind manicured smiles. No staff meetings, no student discussions, no moments where anyone acknowledged what the twins were being dragged through. There were days when Jada would stop just outside the front door and take a breath before walking in. Not because she was afraid, but because it was exhausting. Pretending not to feel what everyone else pretended not to do. Still, they endured. Not with fake smiles or forced laughter, but with unshaken posture and quiet defiance. Every day they showed up was a victory no one could see but them. In the art wing, a student had drawn a mural of the school's founding. It showed white-robed scholars gathered under trees, scrolls in hand, discussing change. Janelle stood in front of it once, staring. "They always show progress," she muttered, as something that happened a long time ago. Jada stepped beside her. "That way they don't have to do it now." They moved through the days like dancers across broken glass, graceful, careful, bleeding just enough to know they were still alive. And beneath it all, that fire kept glowing. Contained, controlled. They hadn't broken yet, but they were close. When Jada and Janelle Rivers stepped through the towering gates of Rosewood Hills Academy, they expected challenges, but not this. Not the stares that clung like shadows, not the silence that screamed. They were ready for the workload, ready to be the new girl, but they weren't ready to become targets from the very first moment. What waited for them beyond those gates wasn't just a new school. It was a system built to make them small. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The school itself looked like a page out of an Ivy League brochure. Grand red brick buildings, wrapped in ivy. Halls lined with mahogany paneling. And a courtyard so perfectly manicured it felt untouched by time. Every detail screamed legacy, tradition, and quiet exclusivity. It was a school that didn't just teach it, reminded you of where you stood. And for Jada and Janelle, it was clear that wherever they stood, it wasn't where anyone else wanted them to be. Their first steps inside were met with a silence too cold to ignore. Students turned just enough to look, whispered just loud enough to be heard. The way their eyes lingered, the way their laughter paused and resumed. It was all part of a quiet orchestration. They weren't curious, they weren't welcoming. They were watching, judging, and deciding. Jada walked with her chin high, posture clean. Janelle stayed just beside her, matching her stride, eyes scanning, but never flinching. They had learned long ago how to move like they belonged, even when everything around them tried to say otherwise. They were daughters of Derek Rivers, a man who raised them not just to survive, but to stand. He didn't sugarcoat the world. He taught them how to see it for what it was, how to carry themselves with strength, how to never let someone else's opinion become their truth, and most importantly, how to control the fire inside them without letting it burn them alive. Derek had made sure they were trained, not just in discipline or posture, but in martial arts. He had taught them balance, power, and precision. But more than the physical, he had taught them emotional discipline. Never swing first. Never fold. Let your silence be your armor. Let your presence speak. And that presence? It unsettled people. They hadn't even made it to their lockers when the first words were thrown. Matching uniforms and matching faces. A boy sneered from where he leaned against the courtyard wall. Didn't know we ordered a set. Jada heard it. Janelle felt it. But they didn't stop. They didn't blink. Their father's voice echoed in their minds. They want your reaction. Don't give it to them. That boy was Ryan Mallory. Blonde, polished, and cocky. He had the effortless charm of someone who'd never been told no. His reputation was well-rooted. A ringleader, untouchable, and always surrounded by boys who followed his lead like shadows. Zach and Brent, loud where Ryan was smooth, cruel where he was calculated. The words that day weren't threats. Not yet. They were just probes. Little digs dressed up as jokes. Microaggressions with a grin. The kind you couldn't call out without being labeled too sensitive. Bet they've never seen a place this clean. Brent chuckled one morning, as they passed. Wonder if they even know how to use a locker, Zach added, not even pretending to whisper. Jada clenched her teeth. Janelle's fingers curled around her bag strap, but they walked on, eyes forward, shoulders back, unshaken on the surface, but the tension underneath was growing heavier each day. In the classrooms, it was no better. Teachers called their names with a tone that clipped their identities short. They were marked present, but treated like absence. No eye contact. No warmth. Just ticking boxes. In the cafeteria, no one invited them to sit. In group projects, no one partnered with them, unless forced. And in every hallway, the crowd seemed to part in a way that forced them off center. Made them feel like intruders in a place they had every right to be. But they never faltered. They weren't just trying to prove something to the school. They were trying to prove something to themselves. That they could hold the line. That they could rise above it. That they could resist without losing themselves. And still, through all of it, Ryan watched. Calculating. Waiting. Testing the line. He wasn't done. Not yet. This wasn't just a test of patience. It was the beginning of a war. And the Rivers sisters, whether they liked it or not, had just entered the battlefield. The sun that poured over Rosewood Hills Academy made the campus glow like a postcard. Red brick buildings, wrapped in ivy, shining walkways lined with ancient trees, and students gliding through it all, like polished pieces in an elite machine. But Jada and Janelle Rivers didn't need long to see past the gloss. They could feel it in the tilt of shoulders as they passed, in the way conversations thinned when they stepped into a room. The school didn't just reject them with words, it exhaled them, politely, deliberately, like something that didn't belong. They had barely made it past the second week when the real weight of it settled in. It began in whispers, never directed at them, just around them. Names not spoken aloud, but implied in the way someone would clear their throat when they entered the room. Or how desks were always just a little too far apart from theirs. One girl in homeroom never made eye contact. Another openly moved her bag if either of them got too close. Small things, easy to brush off. Except it wasn't just students. Teachers called roll and skimmed past their names like they were mistakes in the script. Kirkland, their English teacher, routinely forgot to collect their assignments, then marked them late. In PE, the coach handed out equipment and always seemed to run out just before he got to them. In math, Mrs. Ellsworth referred to them as the quiet ones in the back, as if they were a single entity too indistinct to remember individually. When they raised their hands, the air seemed to thicken. When they answered correctly, the praise was clipped. The hallway between periods became a gauntlet. People brushing past a little too close, bumping shoulders just hard enough to make a point, but not enough to be called out for it. The lockers they'd been assigned were at the far end of the hall, near a section that always seemed colder, quieter. There were days they arrived to find the doors left open, though they swore they'd closed them. Once a folded note sat at the bottom of Jada's locker. Blank, except for a single word scrawled in pencil, transfer. No name, no handwriting to identify. Just the word, pressed deep into the paper as if it had been carved rather than written. They didn't talk about it. Not in detail. Not yet. But they didn't have to. The looks they exchanged said enough. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was packed with unspoken resolve. Ignore it. Janelle said one morning as they sat side by side on the edge of a stone planter near the art wing. Her voice was low, even. Jada didn't answer immediately. She was watching a group of girls across the courtyard, whispering with their backs half turned. I am, she replied finally. Her tone was level, but her jaw was tight. They weren't naive. They had known transferring to Rosewood Hills would come with challenges. Their father had prepared them with blunt truths, with the kind of lessons that wrapped around the mind as tightly as around the fists. But knowing it would come and feeling it slice through them every day were two different things. This wasn't one blow. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Sometimes it was just the sound of laughter when they walked past. Other times it was silence, dead and suffocating. One Friday afternoon, while students shuffled between classes, Jada overheard two girls by the drinking fountain. "Honestly, it's just weird," one said. "They don't even try to talk to anyone." "Well, would you?" the other laughed. "It's like they're constantly on defense, like we're all going to jump them." Jada stood just a few steps away, pretending to look at the student board. Her fists were in her pockets. Her knuckles ached from how tightly they curled. It wasn't about being noticed. It was about being dissected. Everything about them, how they walked, talked, wore their hair, was treated like a disruption. Jada once wore a head wrap on a rainy day. A teacher asked her to remove it, citing dress code, while a girl across the aisle sat comfortably under her beanie without a word. And it was always like that. Quiet exclusions, wrapped in polite language. The classrooms didn't offer sanctuary. In science lab, they were consistently paired together because no one else volunteered. In social studies, a project on community history became an exercise in how to speak without saying anything. After a student presentation featured a slide of neighborhood crime rates with a side glance thrown their way. When Jada and Janelle offered to present on Black historical figures in the area, their request was redirected. Why not do something more local? It was everywhere, subtle and exhausting. No single moment loud enough to scream about, but they were drowning in it all the same. One morning, while walking to class, someone brushed past Janelle, knocking her books loose. It wasn't hard, but it was deliberate. The boy Logan, from history class, offered no apology, just a glance over his shoulder like she was supposed to be the one who got out of the way. Jada bent to help gather the books. Neither spoke. As they stood, Janelle's hand brushed against her sister's, and that was all it took. Grounding. A silent exchange of strength. They weren't alone, not in them. They didn't cry. They didn't snap. But every day added another brick to the wall they were building inside, one that held their fury in place and reminded them who they were. They had been trained for this. Not for violence, not for revenge, but for the clarity of control. Discipline wasn't just about fists. It was about endurance. The contrast between the school's appearance and its spirit grew more jarring by the day. Rosewood Hills boasted tradition and excellence. Its stone fountains, framed awards, and glass-encased trophies painted a picture of integrity. But beneath the sheen lived a culture that thrived on silence. It didn't scream racism. It whispered it behind manicured smiles. No staff meetings. No student discussions. No moments where anyone acknowledged what the twins were being dragged through. There were days when Jada would stop just outside the front door and take a breath before walking in. Not because she was afraid, but because it was exhausting pretending not to feel what everyone else pretended not to do. Still, they endured. Not with fake smiles or forced laughter, but with unshaken posture and quiet defiance. Every day they showed up was a victory no one could see but them. In the art wing, a student had drawn a mural of the school's founding. It showed white-robed scholars gathered under trees, scrolls in hand, discussing change. Janelle stood in front of it once, staring. "They always show progress," she muttered, as something that happened a long time ago. Jada stepped beside her. "That way they don't have to do it now." They moved through the days like dancers across broken glass, graceful, careful, bleeding just enough to know they were still alive. And beneath it all, that fire kept glowing. Contained, controlled. They hadn't broken yet, but they were close. The air in Rosewood Hills Courtyard carried the same sweet breeze it always did, like something borrowed from a well-edited college brochure. But Jada and Janelle could feel it shifting. There was a different kind of charge in it now, the kind that prickled at the back of the neck and never quite let go. Something had changed, and it wasn't just in the way people stared, it was in the way they didn't bother to pretend anymore. Judgment had shed its polite disguise. The waiting was over. Ryan Mallory made his move when the courtyard was full. Not full like during an assembly or pep rally, but full in that perfectly ordinary between-classes way, where students lounged on stone benches, wandered to lockers, or stood in loose clusters whispering about nothing in particular. That's what made it worse. How casual it all felt, like it was just another part of the day. Jada and Janelle were walking side by side, books in hand, eyes forward. They didn't slow down, didn't scan the crowd for trouble. They didn't need to. The energy told them enough. Ryan leaned against a column near the lockers, his friends Brent and Zach flanking him like bored sentries. He didn't bother to lower his voice. That wasn't the point. Well, Ryan drawled, loud enough for heads to turn. Look who's still here. I thought this place had standards. There was a beat of stillness in the air. Not enough for drama. Just enough for people to hear. The pause after his words worked like punctuation, daring someone to challenge him. No one did. Janelle didn't break stride. Jada didn't flinch. But inside something shifted, like the slow tightening of a screw that had already been turned too many times. Brent snorted as the twins passed. I thought janitors used a different entrance, he muttered. Voice dipped in false confusion. Head tilted as if trying to understand something so beneath him it had to be explained. Zach followed with a chuckle that lacked any real humor. Maybe they're just shadowing the real students. You know, like a mentorship program. Laughter scattered through the nearby crowd. Not loud, not unanimous, but loud enough. That was all they needed. All Ryan needed. It wasn't about the words. It was about the performance. About staking a claim. Jada's steps slowed by a hair. Half a breath's worth of hesitation. But she didn't look back. Janelle's hand brushed hers lightly. Not enough to be seen. Just enough to say not here. Not now. Later in algebra, the tension followed them. Their seats near the back of the room, where the teacher barely looked up. Ryan sat diagonally across from them, close enough to throw glances and smirks like darts. When the teacher asked a question Jada answered correctly, Ryan stage whispered, "Whoa, didn't know they taught that in the hood." The classroom didn't erupt. It shifted. A few students snorted. One rolled his eyes. The rest stayed quiet, eyes locked on notebooks, on phones, on anything except what had just been said. The silence wasn't neutral. It was permission. The days that followed didn't blur. They sharpened. Every moment, carved a little deeper. In the hallway between third and fourth period, Brent shoulder-checked Janelle just hard enough to rattle her balance. "Oops," he said flatly, not even looking back. Later, someone kicked Jada's backpack down the hallway. It landed at the feet of two girls who giggled and stepped over it. In the library, they sat alone, not because they chose to, but because no one sat near them anymore. The tables near theirs stayed empty like a radius had been drawn around them, invisible but enforced. They started taking the long way to classes, not out of fear but to avoid crossing the same stretch of hallway where Ryan and his crew seemed to always appear. The route didn't save them. It just delayed the moment. The worst part wasn't what was done, but what wasn't. No teacher said anything. Not when Brent dropped Jada's books on the floor, accidentally. Not when Ryan lingered too long near their lockers, tossing out snide remarks like he was testing the acoustics. Not even when Zach whispered something sharp enough to make a student 2 rows away glance up and then quickly back down. The silence grew thicker. It wasn't just complicity. It was cowardice wrapped in protocol. Nobody wanted to stir anything. Not when it involved the Mallories. Not when it meant acknowledging that their perfect academy had rot in its walls. At home, their father noticed, not immediately, but in increments. It showed in the way Janelle stood at the sink longer after dinner, hands submerged in soapy water, not scrubbing, just standing. It showed in Jada's slower responses when he asked about her day, how her voice remained level, but her eyes didn't quite hold his. One night, he sat at the table after they'd finished eating. The clink of plates long faded. The twins sat across from him, quiet, trying not to show the storm brewing beneath their skin. "You're carrying something," Derek said, folding his hands, voice calm but weighted. "And it's heavier than usual." Jada looked up. Her face was a mask she'd worn too long. "We're handling it," she said. Janelle nodded beside her, eyes sharp but tired. "It's just noise." Derek leaned back slowly, studying them. Noise turns into pressure if you let it build. He didn't push. He didn't need to. He knew them, knew the way they held things, until they cracked. Later that night, in their shared room, Janelle lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. "He knows," she said. Jada sat at the desk, flipping through a book she wasn't reading. "He's waiting for us to say it. Maybe we should. Maybe we wait just a little longer." Outside, the wind had picked up, a slow, rustling breath through the trees. The kind that came before the kind of storm no one wanted to acknowledge, until it was too late. Inside Rosewood Hills, the tension was invisible to those who didn't want to see it. But for the twins, every word, every shove, Every glance, they were lightning strikes, building charge. And in the center of it all, Ryan Mallory smiled like he owned the sky. It was a Monday, the kind where the air felt too still, as if something in the atmosphere knew what waited ahead before the twins did. Jada and Janelle walked the path to their lockers, with the same quiet composure they carried every morning, heads up, books in hand, eyes forward. But before they even reached the corner that curved into the main hall, they felt it. Laughter, not the ordinary kind. It was sharper, meaner, scattered in uneven bursts like someone had hit a nerve and everyone was too amused to pretend they hadn't noticed. The hallway had shifted. Students clustered in loose huddles near the far wall, just out of the way, just enough to make space but not enough to let the twins pass unnoticed. Phones were out. Some faces were expectant. Others avoided eye contact altogether. It was the kind of scene that telegraphed cruelty long before it was visible. As they turned the corner, the crowd's silence broke into whispers, as if the punchline had just walked into the room. Their lockers were covered. Thick red paint dragged across the doors in messy strokes. Slurs scrawled with sick enthusiasm. Cruel words they hadn't heard in years. Their letters exaggerated like the paint itself had been angry. Ugly drawings warped their features. Caricatures of wide eyes, distorted lips, thick hair rendered as chaos. Tape sheets flapped slightly against the metal, each one worse than the last, covered in insults written by too many hands to count. It wasn't the work of one person. It was a project. For a heartbeat, the hallway seemed to pulse around them. Students watched in a silence that wasn't quiet at all. Some laughed openly. Others lifted phones higher to catch a better angle. One boy near the back muttered something under his breath and chuckled. Another took a slow sip from his thermos as if this was all part of a scheduled morning entertainment. Jada stared at the mess, her grip tightening around her books. Janelle took a step forward, then stopped, her jaw clenched so tightly it trembled at the edges. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air between them was thick with what hadn't been said. From down the hall, a teacher appeared, Mr. Tolliver, their history instructor. He slowed as he passed the group, his eyes flicking briefly over the lockers. For a moment, Jada thought he might stop, might speak, might do something, but he didn't. He walked past. No pause, no acknowledgement, just a practiced glance down at the papers in his hand, and a sharper step in his pace. Another teacher followed, moments later. Same thing. Their silence joined the rest. The laughter thinned but didn't stop. It didn't need to. The damage had already been done. The twins stood still. Frozen. Not with fear, but with choice. Every breath stretched longer than it should have. Every second felt like its own weight pressing down. They had endured name-calling. They had taken the shoulder shoves and the whispered slurs. They had swallowed the silence of teachers and the smirks of students. But this was different. This was public, calculated. This was a statement. Janelle bent down first. She didn't speak, just dropped her bag gently to the ground and pulled out a few tissues from the side pocket. She wiped at one of the red letters, but it only smeared, spreading the paint instead of lifting it. Jada crouched beside her without a word, pulling out her own small packet of wipes from her jacket. Together they began cleaning. No one helped. Not a single hand reached out. The crowd didn't disperse. A few girls took photos from the other side of the hallway, trying not to laugh too loudly. Someone muttered, "You'd think they'd be used to cleaning up by now." The words hung in the air like ash. Jada kept her eyes down. She focused on a particular corner of the locker door, where the paint had pooled thick like blood. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, not because it helped, but because it gave her something to do while the fire inside her surged. Janelle's breathing had gone shallow, her hands trembling just enough to betray what she was feeling. She gritted her teeth and scrubbed harder, not to erase the insult, but to channel the heat rising in her chest. They both knew they couldn't cry. Not here, not now, not in front of them. When the final sheet had been peeled off, when the last smear of paint had been pushed to the edge, the hallway was still not empty. But the noise had dulled. Something about the twins' silence made even the worst of them uneasy. There had been no screams, no scene, just two girls cleaning hate off metal while everyone else watched. Jada dropped the stained tissue into her bag with precision. "No more," she said quietly, not looking up. Janelle wiped her hands on the bottom of her shirt, her voice low but firm. "Not again." That wasn't just reaction. It was resolve. A turning point that neither of them said out loud, but both knew they had reached. Not because of the paint, but because of what it meant. They had followed the rules, stayed in their lane, swallowed their pride, and moved in silence. But now they understood. There was no right way to exist in this school. If you didn't fit the picture it had already framed. Their father had told them discipline was strength, and it still was. But strength wasn't just holding back. Sometimes it meant preparing, deciding, drawing a line, not in the sand, but inside yourself. Later that night, the towels they had used to finish scrubbing the lockers still sat in the laundry sink at home, stained pink at the edges, where the red hadn't fully come out. Their father stood in the kitchen, watching his daughters as they ate in near silence. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He saw it in their shoulders, in the cold precision of their movements, in the way they chewed their food like it tasted of concrete. When they were done, Jada pushed her plate forward. They crossed a line, she said plainly. Derek met her eyes. Then what comes next isn't theirs to write. There was no plan yet. No retaliation. No talk of fighting back. Not the way people expected. This wasn't about fists. It was about message. For now, that message lived only in their eyes, their silence, their stillness. But it wouldn't stay there for long. The courtyard looked no different that day. The sun cut clean shadows across the cobblestones. The breeze stirred the trees like it always did. And the students scattered across the benches and steps in the familiar way of a normal lunch break. But Jada and Janelle felt the weight in the air before they stepped into the open space. It wasn't just tension, it was something more deliberate, like an audience already seated before a curtain drop. They moved side by side, their pace steady, their faces unreadable. The past days had sharpened them, not just through pain, but through clarity. After the vandalism, after the silence from those meant to protect them, there was no room left for hoping things would settle, only room for choosing who they were going to be when the next test came. And now, it was here. Ryan Mallory was waiting. He stood near the edge of the courtyard fountain, arms folded across his chest, wearing that smug, slow grin that had always been more about power than humor. Brent and Zach flanked him like stage props. Around them, a circle of students had begun to form, not too obvious, but close enough to witness whatever was about to unfold. The twins didn't change direction. They didn't slow. They walked directly toward the fountain, toward Ryan, toward the moment they had seen coming for weeks. Ryan stepped forward with an exaggerated swagger, voice already raised before he was within reach. "Still showing your faces, huh?" he called. "Guess paint's not permanent enough." Some students chuckled, others stiffened. A few looked away, already sensing the line being approached again. But Ryan didn't notice or didn't care. "You've been walking around like you run this place," he continued. "Louder now. Let me remind you where you really stand." He closed the distance fast, too fast for words to catch up, and shoved Jada hard in the shoulder. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a joke. It was the moment. Jada staggered a step but didn't fall. Her feet rooted like stone. She looked at him, not in anger, but with something far colder. Clarity. Not surprise. Not panic. Just the confirmation that the storm they had braced for was finally here. Janelle shifted beside her. She didn't reach for her sister. She didn't speak. She simply stepped into position like a puzzle piece locking into place. Brent took a half step forward, emboldened by Ryan's push, but he hesitated. Zach followed, grinning like a child who didn't understand the danger in the game he was playing. The three of them circled, not with strategy, but with assumption that strength came from numbers and noise. They didn't realize that the twins weren't flinching. They were aligning. And then it happened. But it didn't happen with chaos. No yelling. No wild swings. It was quiet. Smooth. Precise. Jada sidestepped Ryan's next movement. Without a word, her arm catching his wrist mid-gesture, twisting it just enough to unbalance him. Not to hurt, but to stop. To remind. Janelle's body followed through with trained instinct, stepping between Brent and her sister just as he lunged forward. Her hand rose, not to strike, but to intercept, halting his motion with clean force that redirected his weight off course. Zach, startled by the calm of it all, hesitated too long and was left outside the exchange, staring like he'd entered a room he didn't belong in. The students watching fell into stunned silence. No one laughed. No one moved. They didn't understand what they were seeing. Not right away. They had expected shouting, scrambling, maybe security. But what they saw instead was control, movement that flowed like choreography, every step a beat, and a rhythm too sharp to interrupt. Jada stepped forward and guided Ryan back with one motion, her stance unwavering. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She didn't strike. She made space, claimed it, held it. Janelle mirrored her, turning to Brent with calm precision. "Step back," she said, her first words, soft but undeniable. Brent blinked, his balance lost more by her stillness than any force. Ryan's eyes flicked around the courtyard, his breath sharp. He had thought this would be easy, that humiliation would be one more game. But he hadn't planned for a fight he couldn't control. "What's wrong?" Jada asked, voice even. "This isn't how you thought it would go." He said nothing. His posture gave him away. He wasn't just surprised, he was shaken. Zach took a nervous step toward the crowd. A girl near the front moved back. No one filmed now. No one wanted proof of how badly they'd misread the story. Because in that courtyard, under the crisp midday light, the twins didn't just hold their ground. They rewrote it, without shouting, without threats, without laying a single damaging blow. They moved like people who had been pushed too far, and who knew exactly how much power came with refusing to strike back until it mattered. Ryan tried to recover his posture, but it was gone. His confidence cracked under the weight of being seen, truly seen for the first time. Not as the bold, untouchable boy who ran the school, but as someone out of his depth. Jada stepped past him without another word. Janelle followed. They didn't look back. The crowd parted, slowly, uncertainly, but completely. And in their wake, they left something more powerful than bruises. Silence. Real silence. Not complicit, not amused, just stunned, breath-held stillness. The kind that comes when the world tilts, and no one can pretend it hasn't. What the twins had done wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. And it left the courtyard changed. And it wasn't the twins who looked like the aggressors. Jada and Janelle stood several feet away, backs straight, expressions calm, no gloating, no smug smiles. Just the silence of people who had already processed the moment, and were finished with it. Their eyes didn't search the crowd for support. They didn't need it. They hadn't acted for applause, but the weight of what they'd done, what they hadn't done, held the crowd in place. When the teachers finally arrived, it was too late to stop anything, only just in time to try and control what came next. Mr. Carpenter, the assistant principal, appeared first. His steps were brisk, his tie slightly crooked like he'd been called mid-meeting. Behind him came Coach Linley and Miss Ellsworth, both speaking in hushed tones, as they took in the scene. The gathering of silent students, the three boys clearly shaken, and the two girls standing untouched but entirely unignorable. "What happened here?" Carpenter's voice cracked through the stillness, not as thunder but as the forced noise of someone trying to reassert control. It was Ryan who spoke first. "They jumped us," he said, loud and immediate. His voice wavered on the first syllable but steadied by the end. "We were just talking. Then they started swinging." Brent nodded quickly beside him. "They snapped. Went full psycho." Zach muttered something under his breath that sounded like agreement, but never met anyone's eyes. Carpenter turned to the crowd. "Did anyone see what happened?" The silence deepened. Not because no one had seen, but because no one wanted to be the first to say what they knew. Students looked at their feet, at their phones, at each other. Some wore faces of guilt. Others wore masks of uncertainty. No one stepped forward. Carpenter's frown deepened. He turned to Jada and Janelle, who stood just as they had before, unmoving, unreadable, unshaken. "Well?" he asked. "Do either of you want to explain your side?" Jada met his gaze directly. "We defended ourselves." Janelle added, "That's all we did." Mrs. Ellsworth approached slowly, as if afraid they might crack the air open with a word. "Girls, we need you to come with us to the office. We'll sort this out there." The crowd began to scatter at last, as though released by a signal. Groups broke off in murmurs, some glancing over their shoulders, others slipping away without a word. The tension hadn't lifted. It had simply fractured. In its place came a current of confusion, of disbelief of something unspoken but irreversible. Inside the front office, the walls were too white, too quiet. The air felt filtered and stiff, as if built to erase whatever mess had been left outside. Jada and Janelle sat in the chairs they'd been shown to, hands resting in their laps, eyes forward. Across the room, Ryan sat hunched on the far end of the leather bench, flanked now by his friends and two office aides. His head hung low, not in pain, but in calculation. "Mr. Harrington." The headmaster entered minutes later with a file already in hand. His suit was flawless, his expression lined with the kind of strain that came from trying to keep everything polished while the cracks were already showing. "We're going to begin an internal review," he said carefully, lowering himself into the seat behind the front desk. "But based on the information I have, all 5 of you will be placed on temporary suspension pending further investigation." Ryan looked up quickly. "What? We didn't start it." "Enough," Harrington snapped. Not loud but firm. "We'll hear everyone's full account. Until then, this is school policy." Brent opened his mouth to protest, but Zach pulled at his sleeve. Jada and Janelle said nothing. They hadn't come here to argue. They hadn't needed to. The moment had already said what words couldn't. As the paperwork was printed, the silence stretched. Jada glanced at her sister. Janelle didn't move, but her expression flickered, just enough for them to share one thought. This wasn't defeat. This wasn't regret. This was proof. When their names were called for signatures, they rose together. No hesitation, no bowed heads. As they signed, Harrington watched them with the kind of look that couldn't decide whether it was respect or concern. He had misjudged them. They all had. At the front doors, Derek Rivers waited, his arms folded loosely across his chest. He didn't ask what happened. His eyes read every detail on their faces, every unspoken truth. The girls walked toward him like they'd already crossed something permanent. He opened the car door without a word. The ride home was quiet, not heavy, not tense, just quiet in the way that came after something important had shifted. As they turned onto their street, Derek finally spoke. "You did what you had to do?" Janelle answered first. "We didn't let it slide," Jada added, "but we didn't lose control." Their father nodded slowly, a quiet satisfaction behind the motion. "Then you're still ahead." The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be meetings, accusations, red tape, but that no longer mattered, because in a school that had done everything it could to erase them, they had finally made something undeniable. The crowd had fallen silent, but the truth had never spoken louder. The office air smelled faintly of toner and coffee, but beneath it lingered something heavier, the charged stillness of bureaucracy bracing for fallout. The chairs where Jada and Janelle sat were too stiff, too small, their backs straightened, and not by comfort, but by principle. They had said what needed to be said. The rest now unfolded without their control. Across the desk, Mr. Harrington flipped through a folder with mechanical precision. His voice, when it came, was cool and practiced, as though this weren't the most important conversation he'd had all year. After consultation with administration and review of the incident, he said, placing 2 identical sheets on the desk before them, "You are both being placed on temporary suspension, effective immediately." The twins didn't move. Their hands remained folded in their laps, eyes steady. The words didn't hit like a blow, not because they didn't matter, but because they were already expected. This wasn't about punishment. It was about control. Mr. Carpenter stood just behind Harrington's shoulder, silent but visibly tense, like he knew the optics were off but didn't have the authority to stop what was happening. Derek Rivers arrived as the final signature was being added. He stepped into the room not with aggression, but with gravity. His presence didn't announce itself. It settled. Every head turned without being told to. His daughters looked up, and in their father's face they didn't see anger. They saw focus, stillness, the kind of stillness that holds until it absolutely must move. "I'm here for Jada and Janelle Rivers," Derek said, his voice even. "I understand there's been a disciplinary decision." Mr. Harrington gestured to the papers with a tight smile. "A temporary measure, Mr. Rivers. While we sort through the accounts, the school must be thorough." Derek didn't sit. He didn't nod. He looked directly at Harrington. "Thoroughness," he said slowly, "would have been a better approach before my daughters were harassed, followed, mocked, and targeted for weeks." Carpenter shifted. Harrington stiffened. "There's a process." "There was a process," Derek cut in. "Still calm, still steady. And it failed. Now you're managing fallout, not discipline." Before Harrington could respond, the door burst open without a knock. Chandra Mallory, dressed in a crisp white blouse and fury, stormed in as if the building belonged to her. Greg followed close behind, jaw clenched, eyes already narrowed in accusation. "This is outrageous," Sandra barked. "My son was attacked and this school is acting like he's the problem?" Greg crossed his arms and glared directly at Derek. "Your girls assaulted my boy, and you're standing here like you're owed something." Jada's jaw tightened slightly. Janelle didn't blink. Derek didn't turn to them. He kept his gaze on the headmaster. "Is this what your process allows, Mr. Harrington?" Sandra took a step closer, her voice sharp, trembling on the edge of control. You think being calm makes you right. You think standing there like some saint changes what your daughters did. They defended themselves, Derek replied, his voice low and unshaken. And I won't let you twist that into something else just because you're uncomfortable with the consequences. You people always play the victim, Greg snapped, his words sliding just past a dangerous line. Silence pulsed through the room. Carpenter's eyes darted to Harrington. The headmaster swallowed, but said nothing. Derek turned his head then, not fast, not dramatic, but deliberate. His eyes found Greg's, and held them there. There it is, Derek said. The part you usually save for when no one's listening. Greg took a step forward. Derek didn't move, didn't flinch. His stillness wasn't passive. It was dominant. Not the stillness of restraint, but the stillness of choice. You came here for a fight, Derek said. Quieter now. But I came for the truth. That's the difference between us. Sandra scoffed. You're unbelievable. No, Derek replied. I'm prepared. Harrington rose, finally, hands out, trying to regain authority. Enough. This is not how we handle conflict. It's how you allowed it, Derek interrupted. Calmly. By doing nothing while my daughters were targeted. By acting only once. It became inconvenient to ignore. His words didn't rise in pitch. They didn't need to. The weight of them landed like iron. And no one in the room missed the point. Sandra turned to Harrington, desperate to recover ground. Are you going to let him stand here and accuse us of what? Racism? Harrington's silence was an answer all its own. Jada rose then, followed by Janelle. They didn't speak. Their presence said enough. They were done answering for the fear other people projected onto them. Derek looked at his daughters, and then back to Harrington. Suspension or not, he said. We're not finished here. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. And that's coming, with or without your permission. The door opened, and the three of them walked out. Not with haste but with purpose. The Mallorys stayed behind, wrapped in their indignation, louder than ever but less certain now. In the hall, Janelle spoke first. That was different. Jada gave a small nod. He didn't even raise his voice. Derek smiled just barely. You don't have to be loud to be heard. The suspension would hold. The school would stall. But something had shifted that day. Not in policy, but in perception. They weren't shadows anymore. They were seen, and they were far from finished. Open the damn door, Rivers! Greg Mallory. Derek reached the handle and opened it in one smooth motion. No hesitation, no theatrics, just quiet readiness. Greg stood on the porch in a wrinkled blazer and fury, his face already red at the edges. Beside him, Sandra gripped a handbag with white-knuckled hands, her eyes darting across the yard as if checking for an audience. And behind them, their son Ryan sat in the car, the engine still running, head ducked low. You think you can embarrass my family? Greg barked, stepping forward too fast. Think you can make us look weak and just walk away? Derek didn't step back. You embarrassed yourselves, he said calmly. I simply didn't stop you. You've been poisoning this school with your sob stories and fake victim act, Sandra spat, stepping forward now. You want to play humble father in the news while your girls assault our son. My daughters defended themselves, Derek said, eyes never leaving Greg. And I've defended them every step of the way, including now. You've pushed it too far, Greg growled, and I'm here to settle it. Derek's voice didn't rise. You're not here for justice. You're here because you lost. Greg lunged forward, no warning, no words, his arm swinging out in one wide, clumsy arc. But Derek had already moved. He didn't hit, didn't shove. He pivoted, sidestepping Greg with emotion, so clean it looked rehearsed. He reached out, caught Greg's wrist in midair, and turned his momentum into nothing more than an awkward stumble. Greg nearly fell into the porch railing, catching himself with a grunt. Sandra shrieked. Greg! She lunged forward, her hand reaching for Derek's shoulder, her voice high with panic and performance. But Derek turned again, this time stepping slightly to the side and simply raising one hand, not to strike, but to block. He didn't grab her, didn't restrain her, just held space with quiet authority. Don't touch my family, he said, low and precise. Greg recovered and stormed forward again. Fists clenched tighter now, but his fury was loud and uncoordinated, built on assumption, not skill. Derek stood still. You've got one shot to walk away with, what little you still have, Derek said. Take it. Greg's foot hit the porch step hard. You don't scare me. I don't need to, Derek replied. By now, neighbors had begun to appear at their doorways. Some watched through blinds. Others stepped out fully onto porches. One couple crossed their arms, whispering quietly. Another woman down the street reached for her phone, already dialing. Sandra's voice broke again, her anger tangled now with fear. We have influence, Derek. We know people. This'll come back on you. It already did, he answered. And you're losing. Greg made one last charge, but the desperation in his movement made it easy. Derek stepped back and let Greg's own momentum carry him forward. Off balance, off script, Greg stumbled. Not from force but from failure. He caught the porch column, panting, red-faced, humiliated. Derek didn't touch him. He didn't need to. Control had already shifted. Sirens whined in the distance, faint but rising fast. The unmistakable sound of authority arriving, of someone else now taking over what never should have come this far. Sandra backed away, chest heaving. Greg turned, dazed. Ryan's face appeared briefly behind the windshield before ducking back down. Jada and Janelle stepped forward then, not because they had to, but because they'd seen enough. Go home, Jada said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was final. Janelle added, It's over. You just haven't realized it yet. The sirens grew louder. A police cruiser turned onto the street, then another. Greg took a slow, stumbling step backward. Derek didn't move. You came looking for a fight, Derek said, voice low and steady. Now you found it. The patrol cars stopped at the curb, lights flashing silently at first. Officers stepped out, reading the tension like a language they'd been trained to speak. One of them approached the river's porch, nodding to Derek, who stood straight, unshaken. Is everyone safe here, sir? The officer asked. Yes, Derek said. But you may want to speak to the people who arrived uninvited. The Mallorys said nothing. No threats now, just heavy silence, and the uncomfortable recognition that control had slipped entirely from their hands. Across the street, cameras and phones caught the final image. Derek Rivers standing on his porch, composed, surrounded by his daughters, as the lights danced red and blue across his face. Not a man defeated, but one who had stood his ground.
Not with fists.
With truth. And it was louder than any scream. The fluorescent lights of the station buzzed faintly above, humming with the same dispassionate indifference that clung to every institutional hallway. The walls, pale and scuffed at the corners, offered no comfort, just the neutral blankness of a place where stories came to be sorted, filed, and sometimes buried. But today, something different lingered in the air. Not just tension, something sharper, like truth, finally making its way to the surface. Derek Rivers sat with his daughters in the main reception area, their posture quiet but poised. The heat of the confrontation at home had not followed them here. Instead, a colder clarity had settled in, not the kind that needed explanation, but the kind that came from knowing you'd done everything right, even when the world expected you to fail. Officer Clean moved through the front, clipboard in hand, his steps purposeful. He was a man who had seen plenty of false alarms, fabricated heroics, and tangled truths. But from the moment he stepped out of the cruiser and onto the river's porch earlier that evening, he had sensed this wasn't one of those cases. Now inside the station, it was his job to strip away the noise and see what remained. Mr. Rivers, Clean said, stepping into the open space between them. We'll start with you. Derek nodded once and rose to his feet. His voice when he spoke was even, neither defensive nor proud. They came to my home, angry, shouting. My daughters were inside. I opened the door. Greg Mallory tried to hit me. You struck him? Clean asked. Not accusing, just recording. I didn't have to, Derek replied. He lost his balance on his own. The moment was his, not mine. Jada and Janelle listened quietly, as their father gave his account. No embellishment. No flinching. He described the arrival, the threats, Sandra's shouting, Greg's failed aggression, and then he stepped back. Clean turned to the girls. You two stayed inside. Janelle answered first, voice composed. Yes, sir. We saw everything, but we didn't go outside until it was over. Jada nodded. We didn't touch them. We didn't speak to them until after it ended. Their testimony wasn't rehearsed, but it didn't need to be. The events had branded themselves into their memories. Every movement etched clearly by adrenaline and restraint. There was nothing to exaggerate, and nothing to hide. Clean jotted notes, glancing up only once to observe the steadiness in their faces. This wasn't defiance. It was composure. and it didn't match the story he'd just heard from the other room. In the adjacent interview chamber, Sandra Mallory was mid-performance. Her voice sharp, her blouse wrinkled from the drive. She waved her arms with theatrical precision as she recounted a version of events that had already begun to fray at the edges. "We came to talk," she said, over and over, as if repetition alone could make it true. "And he attacked my husband. In front of our son. He was violent. Aggressive. It was terrifying." Her words bounced off the walls like cheap glassware. "Unconvincing. Hala." Greg sat beside her in silence, arms crossed, a thin line of frustration etched across his brow, not because he was afraid, but because it wasn't going the way he expected. He had assumed outrage would be enough, that status and fury, and loud declarations could shift the narrative before the facts settled in, but even he could see the tide shifting. Outside the room, Officer Clean reviewed the growing stack of witness statements from the Rivers neighborhood. One by one, neighbors had stepped forward, calm, articulate, detailed. They spoke of shouts, of slurs shouted from Sandra's mouth, of Greg pushing past Derek toward the porch, of Derek's restraint, even when provoked. One neighbor, a retired teacher from across the street, had even offered her doorbell camera footage. The image was slightly tilted, the sound a bit muffled, but the motion was clear. Greg lunging, Derek stepping back, Sandra shouting obscenities just off screen. The moment was there, caught, preserved. Clean rubbed his forehead, eyes narrowed at the paper trail forming before him. There was no sign of a man defending his family in Greg Mallory, no image of an innocent woman in Sandra. What he saw instead was entitlement, shaken by a world that no longer tilted in their favor. He returned to Derek and his daughters, the weight of the evidence anchoring his steps. "I've spoken to your neighbors," Clean said, voice more grounded now. "Reviewed preliminary footage. Everything confirms your account so far." Derek didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just met the officer's eyes. "I expect the rest will come out too," he said. "It will," Clean replied. "We'll take formal statements now, but I wanted you to hear it from me. You're not under suspicion. Not anymore." Janelle exhaled slowly. Not relief exactly, but a release, a loosening of something tight that had wound itself around her chest since the porch. Jada looked at her father, eyes clear. "Does this mean it's over?" Derek's voice was quiet, but firm. "It means we're being heard." It was the first time anyone had said it out loud in that way. Not a promise, but a confirmation that the silence that had followed them through every hallway at school, every ignored whisper and sideways glance, was finally cracking. In the corner of the station, Sandra raised her voice again, demanding to speak to a superior, insisting on her rights. Her words rang loud, but they no longer echoed the way they had before. Not here, not now. Because here, the truth had begun to rise. And nothing, not fury, not fiction, not fear could stop it anymore. The walls of the station were quiet now, not silent, but hushed, like the building itself had settled into a breathless wait for the truth to unfold. Officer Clean moved with the sharp focus of someone who had stepped over the line between assumption and evidence, and now walked only where facts led. He entered the side room carrying a black plastic folder marked with the school's insignia, Rosewood Hills Academy, and a flash drive, freshly delivered by a responding officer who had collected it directly from the school's IT department. Derek looked up from his seat as Clean returned, but didn't speak. His daughters sat on either side of him, still composed, still grounded, but the weight in their posture showed they were tired. Not defeated, but run through. Still, their eyes remained alert, their shoulders unbowed. Clean sat across from them and slipped the drive into the monitor behind the front desk. A muted video window popped open on the screen. Time-stamped. The hallway footage rolled first. The locker vandalism. Paint. Papers. The crude drawings. The mess the twins had found that morning, now frozen in pixels. There was no audio, but it didn't need any. Brent was visible, standing just a few feet away, spraying the final streak of red across the locker. Zach laughed and took a photo. Ryan leaned against the wall, arms folded like the whole thing was entertainment. No one else intervened. Another clip followed, a hallway shove from a few days prior. Jada, stepping out of class, Brent turning just in time to bump her shoulder and scatter her books across the floor. Again Zach laughing. Again Ryan standing still like a statue carved from smugness. Then came the courtyard. Clean tapped the screen, zooming in as much as he could. There was no mistaking it. Ryan's shove. Brent's move toward Janelle. The twins' response. Not attack, not assault, just movement. Coordinated, defensive, controlled. And the stillness that followed it all. He turned the screen toward the Rivers family. This is just a portion, he said. More's being processed. But from what I've seen, it supports every word you've given us. Derek nodded once. Let it play, he said. While the footage looped, another officer entered the station, carrying a small bundle of typed papers. He handed them to Clean, lowering his voice. Statements. Students. 4 so far. 2 juniors, 2 freshmen. One's anonymous, the rest signed. Clean opened the folder. As he read, a pattern emerged. One student wrote about the whispered slurs in biology class. Another had witnessed Ryan mocking Janelle outside the auditorium, calling her background noise. One freshman mentioned the locker incident, and how they'd overheard the boys planning it in the cafeteria. They all matched the timeline. They all backed the twins. Clean took a slow breath, then looked across the room to the glass-walled side office, where Sandra and Greg sat with forced composure. He stood, gathered the statements, the drive, and the school file, and crossed the room. Inside, Sandra's voice had worn itself down. She looked up as Clean entered, expecting more delay, maybe a final warning. Instead, he laid the folder down and opened it to the still image of the locker paint. Brent mid-spray. This is your son's friend, Clean said, flipping to the next still, Ryan in the courtyard, arm extended in mid-shove. And this, he continued, tapping a frame, is the moment it escalated. Greg's jaw tensed. Sandra tried to speak. That could be anything. We also have statements, Clean said, turning to the next file. From students. From teachers, who never reported what they saw. From neighbors. It's over, Sandra faltered. They, your officers, they didn't even touch my son. Because your son didn't need to be touched, Clean replied, his voice cool but solid. He created the fire, and stood too close. Greg looked down at the table, his hands curling into fists that no longer had anywhere to swing. The performance had run its course. Even he knew now that the story had shifted too far from them to be pulled back. Sandra pressed a trembling hand to her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying, Clean said, that we are moving forward with formal charges. Harassment. Conspiracy to intimidate. And if the school pursues additional action based on our findings, the expulsion will hold, whether you like it or not. Outside the glass, Derek stood beside his daughters, watching the scene play out. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He had seen this moment coming from the moment he opened the door and found Greg Mallory on his porch. It had never been about the fist. It had been about who could stand longer when the truth was forced into the light. The twins watched, quiet but not still. Their breathing had changed, eased slightly. There was no celebration in them, no smugness. Just a small, quiet certainty that after everything, their voices had finally reached the ears they were meant. When Clean returned, he didn't bring more questions, just a printed statement form and a pen. We're locking it in, he said. This is for record, but I think you already know. Your part's done. Janelle took the pen first. Signed. Jada followed. Clear, sharp strokes. Derek didn't smile, but his eyes for the first time that day softened, just slightly. Across the station, as Sandra sank deeper into her chair, and Greg's shoulders caved inward, the noise that had followed the Rivers family since the first day at Rosewood Hills finally began to fade. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because now, the truth was louder, and it wasn't going away. The soft click of the handcuffs didn't echo, but it cut through the police station like a line drawn in final ink. Greg Mallory stood stiff, jaw locked, wrists bound tightly in front of him, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's. Beside him, Sandra's voice had shrunk into a strained murmur, her protests drowned beneath the shuffle of official paperwork and the steady movement of uniformed officers, who no longer needed to ask questions. Their names had been written at the top of the report, Greg and Sandra Mallory. Underneath, a list of charges that read like a summary of everything they had tried to deny. Assault, harassment, trespassing, obstruction. The weight of it wasn't in the paper, but in the way the officers moved with certainty, with protocol, with the calm of people whose job was no longer in dispute. There would be no more speeches, no more threats, just the slow, orderly march of accountability. Jada and Janelle stood in the far corner of the station beside their father. They didn't speak, didn't shift, They just watched as the people who had stood over them with laughter and cruelty, now left with silence wrapped around their ankles. There was no pleasure in it, only clarity. Truth had arrived with its sleeves rolled up, not dramatic, but thorough. Officer Clean nodded once to Derek, as the Mallorys were escorted through the front entrance. Derek returned the gesture, still stone quiet, his arms folded, his daughters close at his side. He hadn't come for vengeance. He hadn't raised his voice once, but here they were, the story finally phasing the light. By the time they left the station, the sky had turned a shade darker, the sun slipping behind a curtain of soft clouds. The streets were quieter than usual. Word had already begun to travel, first through texts, then whispers, then full sentences exchanged at gas stations and parking lots. But the biggest reckoning waited not in the neighborhood, but back at the school. Rosewood Hills Academy stood tall the next morning, just as it always had. The flag waved from its pristine white pole. The courtyard was swept, and the morning announcements played at exactly 8 a.m. But the students felt it in the halls. A shift. Something old was unraveling. Something new pressed beneath their feet. At 8:15, the front office issued an email blast to all faculty, students, and families. Effective immediately, the students involved in the events under investigation have been permanently expelled. Names: Ryan Mallory, Zach Carver, Brent Larson. The findings from the joint investigation with the local police have been reviewed and verified. All incidents captured on school property were in direct violation of our student conduct code, including but not limited to targeted harassment, racial intimidation, conspiracy to intimidate, and inciting public disorder. For a campus built on reputation, the message hit like thunder in a chapel. Inside the main office, Headmaster Harrington stood before the school board, pale and composed, the same stiff knot of a tie clinging to his throat. But his voice was different. Not defensive, not polished, honest, humbled, as if the facts had stripped away every layer he had once used to avoid discomfort. "I failed them," Harrington said, hands resting on the edge of the polished conference table. "Jada and Janelle Rivers trusted this school with their education, and we offered them silence in return." The board members were still. No one interrupted. "I allowed a culture of dismissal to go unchecked," he continued, "and when the storm arrived, I tried to minimize it instead of confront it. That ends now." There were no objections. Later that day, Jada and Janelle were called into the administration office. Not for a reprimand, not for punishment, for acknowledgement. They arrived in uniform, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Harrington stood behind his desk, not in his usual posture of distant authority, but as a man attempting to own what he had ignored. "I know no apology can erase what you experienced," he began, "but I owe you one anyway. You were failed by your classmates, by the faculty, and by me." The twins said nothing. "Not yet. You'll return to class as students in good standing," Harrington continued. "Your suspension records have been formally expunged, and I've personally ensured that a new system of accountability will be implemented immediately, starting with faculty bias training and a full overhaul of our incident reporting." It sounded like progress, but Jada didn't nod. She waited, looked at him with the same clarity she'd shown in the courtyard. "We didn't come back just for ourselves," she said quietly. Janelle stepped forward beside her. "There are other students still walking through these halls, who look like us, sound like us, think like us, and they're still being watched, not seen. If you're serious about change," Jada added, "then make it right for every student, not just the ones who had to fight to be heard." Harrington absorbed the words, and for the first time, didn't rush to respond. He simply nodded, not to perform agreement, but to accept responsibility. As the twins left the office, the hallway outside felt different, not brighter, not easier, but clearer. The students they passed didn't speak, but some nodded, others looked away, but no one laughed, no one whispered. They had faced the system. Now the system had to face itself. The gates of Rosewood Hills Academy creaked open like they always had, slow and smooth, polished like everything else on the campus. But today, something in the air was different, thicker somehow. Not tense, not hostile, just aware. As if the school itself had finally woken up and was learning how to listen for the first time. Jada and Janelle Rivers stepped through the entrance side by side, their uniforms pressed, hair braided clean, shoes shining against the slate stone path. The same gates that once felt like a barrier now opened like a threshold. They walked without hurry, without hesitation, No one was behind them, no one ahead, and still somehow, everyone saw them. From windows, from hallways, from second-floor landings where quiet eyes peeked out between blinds and locker doors. But these weren't the same stares as before. The whispers were gone, so were the smirks. What remained was something less noisy, more complicated, curiosity layered with respect, recognition mixed with unease, a space where ignorance had been scrubbed, just enough for truth to settle in. The courtyard, where it had all come to a head, held its breath as they crossed. Same flagpole, same fountain. But the silence wasn't mocking anymore. It was observant. Students gathered at their usual benches didn't say a word. Some looked up. A few nodded. One even offered a quiet smile that flickered quick as a blink. The sound of shoes on stone became the only rhythm in the open air. The twins passed the bench where Brent used to sit. It was empty now. Past the column where Zach used to lean with folded arms and smug shoulders. No one stood there. Past the stairs where Ryan had once let his voice cut the air like a knife. No trace of them remained. Inside the building, even the teachers moved differently. Mr. Langford, the literature teacher who once called roll, without looking up offered them a measured greeting and held the door longer than necessary. Coach Lindley gave a quiet nod when they passed, eyes meeting theirs without flinching, and Mrs. Ellsworth, the chemistry teacher who'd pretended not to hear the hallway jokes weeks ago, caught their eyes from across the room and didn't look away. This wasn't some grand apology, but it was a shift, and shifts matter. As they moved toward their lockers, they passed a group of juniors clustered near the vending machine. Last semester, those same kids had snickered when Janelle dropped her binder. Today, they parted quietly, not out of fear but with a respect that hadn't existed before. Janelle looked over at her sister. Feels different. Jada's eyes scanned the hall, slow and sharp. Because it is. Their lockers were clean now, the slurs and paint scrubbed away. But they remembered. They always would. Not as pain, but as record. A reminder that truth takes time, and change costs something. The bell rang, and instead of scrambling into a crowd that ignored them, they moved through classmates who now noticed, who made space, who didn't look through them anymore. When they stepped into their first class, every head turned, not fast, not forced, just a quiet full acknowledgement, not as new kids, not as outliers, as presents. Mrs. Palmer, the civics teacher who'd once brushed past a raised hand without pausing, cleared her throat at the podium and spoke before anyone could settle too deep into silence. "Before we begin," she said, her voice steady but slower than usual, "I'd like to welcome Jada and Janelle back, and I want to say directly that we're glad you're here." Truly, no one clapped, but no one scoffed either. The twins nodded politely and took their seats, just like that, as if they'd never left, but with everyone knowing now exactly why they had. Later, in the library, they sat by the tall glass windows facing the courtyard. Light spilled across the tables in golden patches. Janelle flipped through her notes. Jada stared out across the stone path that used to feel like a battlefield. She thought about the hallway stairs, the locker vandalism, the slow burn of silence that screamed louder than slurs. And then she thought about today, about the shift, the stillness, the change. Their father's voice echoed in her mind, the way it always did when the world slowed enough for meaning to catch up. "The storm is over." Janelle looked up. "What?" Jada turned back. A small breath in her chest. "We ended it." Not all storms disappear with thunder. Some fade slowly, slipping into the cracks they once howled through. This one left behind clear skies, not perfect, not quiet, but clear enough to see the way forward. At the end of the day, the girls stood on the school steps once more, the sun behind them, the shadow of the building stretching long into the parking lot. They didn't need to speak. The world had already heard them. And as they stepped down, side by side, the final image etched itself into the day. Unbroken, unafraid, together. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs to remember what courage looks like. Speak up, stand tall, stay ready. Because the next storm could rise anywhere, and someone out there is still waiting to be seen.